Severn Valley Railway Oral History Podcasts, collecting the stories and memories of our earliest volunteers.
Good morning, Malcolm.
Good morning.
We're now recording. My name's Richard Apps. It's the 19th of February 2020.
So Paul, I want to start just by taking you back to the beginning of your journey and ask how you became interested in the railway.
And he said, I'm involved with this new little railway called the Severn Valley Railway. Would you like to come and visit?
There was still this scepticism that we were playing trains and we got no chance, but we carried on.
Episode 2, The First Locos. Welcome to our second oral history podcast. My name is Julia Letts, and over the last few weeks I've been going through the oral history interviews that we recorded just before lockdown with some of the Severn Valley Railway's first volunteers. The recordings are full of amazing memories of the early days, and in order to share some of these stories with you, we decided to create a series of podcasts. This is the second one. If you missed the first, it explained how the Severn Valley Railway Society, as it was known then, came into being, at a meeting at the Cooper's Arms in Kidderminster in 1965. We charted the efforts of the first volunteers to buy the line from Bridgnorth to Hampton Load. In the first podcast, we got as far as the summer of 1966 and SVR's first open day. So in part 2, we'll focus on locomotives, memories of getting the first engine, 3205, the creation of the first carriage works, and the acquisition of more locomotives and carriages from a train scrapyard in South Wales. So let's go back to 1966. The new SVR volunteers had made a great start on their railway, but they still didn't have anything to run on it. All that changed when a man called David Rouse offered to help. Two of our earliest volunteers, Keith Beddoes and John Hill, take up the story.
I myself wrote to the Birmingham Loco Club about getting engines up there, because we couldn't afford an engine. And what happened, amongst other things, that there were a lot of ex-railway men coming up to see us. There was a chap named David Rouse. He lived down Newton Abbot way. He was the trustee of Loco 3205. He'd come up and seen us and he thought we were doing a good job. He was most impressed, and what he did say was, if you can get the money to secure the line, then he would bring his loco up.
The engine itself was built at Swindon in 1946 for what was the last remaining days of the old Great Western Railway. It was classed as a light engine in terms of its usability on all kinds of lines, and it certainly moved around on the western region, eventually being withdrawn, and Mr. David Rouse came along and formed a society to raise money to buy it, which they eventually did. And it was stored in the yard at Totnes.
In the meantime, we managed to pay a deposit of 2,500, which secured the line. And so then negotiations went on with the Severn Valley and this David Rouse, and he eventually brought his loco up in March 1967.
The movement date was agreed with British Rail, and driver Cyril Williams, who was based at Stourbridge, drove it from Stourbridge to Bewdley, and I took over at Bewdley.
Will you talk me through that journey, so from Bewdley to Bridgnorth, what you can remember of that particular occasion?
I think the feeling was just being completely overcome with what I was doing. I was taking the first engine back onto Severn Valley, and we were about to achieve what we'd always set out to do. And when we got to Bridgnorth, the station was absolutely full of people, and we were greeted by the mayor of Bridgnorth on arrival. The photographers, they just had a field day with us. A tremendous day. We sat back on the station benches and just looked at the engine standing there and all the people round us and sort of said, we've done it. And we had.
Can you remember that day?
Oh, yeah. Everybody does, I think. You know, yeah, I went up on the bus, and the bus was packed out. Everybody was milling around, excited. Oh, my God, it was a day to remember.
And Keith goes on to reveal why this day is so firmly etched in his memory, and it's a great story. Picture the scene. 3205 has finally arrived at Bridgnorth, but the excited crowd can only admire her. They can't yet travel on her. Or can they? Keith takes up the story.
There was quite a few on the footplate, and David Rouse decided, chaps, do you want to trip down the line? So, oh, that'd be great. I was thinking we were just going to go down outside the station or up to the viaduct, which shouldn't have been allowed. We were only allowed to run it. Anyway, the coal was put on, and away we went towards Erdington. Of course, the whistle was being blown, and we were all chuckling, laughing and whatever, and it was getting darkish by that time. And we got to Erdington and stopped, and the fire hole door was opened and to see what the coal situation was. So David Rouse put some coal on the fire, and the actual footplate was like the ghost train. Our images were silhouetted against the embankment there. Whittle's coach came and passed and stopped outside Erdington station, and you could see all the people wiping the condensation off the windows, looking at this train that suddenly appeared, just like the ghost train. And they followed it back to Bridgnorth, and that was fantastic. Of course, when we got back to Bridgnorth, oh, we were in trouble, because we shouldn't have gone out of the station limits. Plus the fact that we were blowing the whistle all the way there and back again was getting at people's backs. And of course, these are the people we were trying to prove that we were playing trains. Well, that particular day we were playing trains. Bert Cleaver was the secretary. He blew his top, you know. You mustn't do that again. So we didn't.
Keith Beddoes. And before we move on, here are a couple more memories from that momentous day in 1967, the day that 3205, the very first engine, arrived on the SVR line, travelling from Stourbridge to Bewdley and then to Bridgnorth. Column Howell, who like Keith had been involved since the beginning, was there to greet the engine at Bewdley, as was teenager Paul Fathers, who at 13 would go on to become SVR's youngest volunteer.
I had a tip-off from the station master, a Mr. Guard, who was a lovely, lovely Devonian. And he phoned me up and he said, Column, he said, there's a steamer arriving, in his Devon accent. He was a Newton Abbot man. And of course I went up and saw 3205 arrive. Beautiful it was. Talk about cameras, yes, in those days, not the sophisticated cameras you have now or videos. Lots of old box cameras, lots of early colour film was beginning to come out, desperately expensive. But the engine arrived at Bewdley, and off it then disappeared to Bridgnorth, and wow.
I jumped on my bike and took my box brownie camera over to Bewdley, and was there shaking with excitement when it arrived. So I'd not been interested in trains, I hadn't been a train spotter. Steam trains were still running on the main line further north at places like Crewe and Shrewsbury, but it wasn't something that had interested me. So then I became more involved, and we started at Bridgnorth working on a rail car which arrived shortly after 3205, and that was the origin of the carriage and wagon department, which has gone on from strength to strength over the years and has restored many of the coaches that are now in use on the Severn Valley.
And so a new chapter in SVR's history began, with more and more members involved in the acquisition and restoration of engines and carriages, and others joining the Permanent Way team to improve and revamp the line from Bridgnorth to Hampton Load. It was a time of great excitement and endless possibilities, perfectly captured here by Paul Fathers.
The rail car arrived, and I remember going up to Erdington Holt to watch it being towed up to Bridgnorth by 3205, and then once it arrived, attempts were made to start the engines and to get it running, but that failed initially. And so every other Sunday we would go to Bridgnorth, and we'd start stripping the paint off the rail car and restoring it back to its original condition. After a while, we were able to take a lease out on the goods shed at Bewdley in about 1968. So we moved the carriage department down to Bewdley and started working from the goods shed. We didn't have any electricity, we only had a gas supply for the lighting in the goods shed. But we rented the goods shed, and I think it was 60 yards of track. But within a couple of years, we've managed to fill the yard with coaches that we were working on. In those days, the trains weren't running. We eventually reopened the railway in 1970, and many of us went to Bridgnorth to help clean through to 05, ready for the first train, and jumped on board, even though we didn't have tickets, into the brake van and travelled on the first train to Hampton Load.
And how was that experience travelling on the first train, sort of in preservation to Hampton Load?
Well, it was exciting. I think the whole concept of amateurs taking over a disused railway line was something that sparked the imagination of many people. I think also you've got to remember the times in the 1960s. It was a time of change, time of revolution in many ways. Most of us had long hair. We regarded ourselves, I think, as being slightly like rebels in that we were able to do something against authority almost. We didn't have any support from British Railways as it was then. They took a very dim view of amateurs running their own private railway on a nationalised railway system. Likewise, the County Council objected to the light railway order being granted on the grounds that Bridgnorth was due to have a bypass. So it would lead to extra cost to build a bypass bridge. So we were really fighting against the tide in order to reopen it. So by the time we did open the railway, we were granted the light railway order and were able to run the first train. It was a period that was full of excitement for us all. In fact, even talking about it, I feel excited because it rekindles those memories.
Paul Fathers. And it's one of the joys of recording oral history that it does rekindle old memories like this. I find that as the interviewer, or the person listening, you really are transported back in time and get caught up in the excitement, the sense of purpose and the camaraderie. Sometimes exact dates and precise details have merged or faded, but in general the memories are astonishingly clear, and all from events that happened more than 50 years ago. If you recall those early days, please get in touch. We're really keen to record more interviews and add more stories to our archive. Several of the people we've recorded were involved in acquiring and retrieving those first locomotives, carriages and parts. The age of steam was over, and BR's redundant engines were decaying in rail yards and scrapyards all over the UK. Groups of SVR enthusiasts got together to buy available engines. Here's David Williams explaining to Tom Richardson how he got involved.
Although it was 1967 before the first locomotive came, within a few years we'd got 7 or 8 locomotives, all with different. Small is beautiful when it comes to buying steam locomotives. Even then they were very expensive.
Were you involved in buying a number of them, or
yeah,
were you just involved
ultimately 3 for me. We eventually had 26 steam locomotives, and 3 of them I was involved in. The first one involved 18 members. That was straight off British Railways, the first one. It came to us in the last couple of days of steam operation on British Railways. It became illegal within a week or 2 afterwards. And the next steam loco I had anything to do with was a few years later, and we managed to buy a couple of locomotives from a scrapyard in Barry in South Wales. There were 200 locomotives at Barry Dock, just behind the Barry Holiday Resort, in fact.
I've seen the wonderful picture of them all,
yes,
all
lined
up.
Yes, that's right. But I think the Severn Valley Railway, in the end, collectively had more out of that yard than any. We ultimately had 13 steam locomotives out of there. But I was concerned with 2 of them. The first one cost us £2,500, and 200 people put money in to get that in one form or another. And then the last one we had cost us £3,000. That involved 800 people put money in it. So 18 for the first one, 200 for the second, 800 for the third.
Demonstrates very well how the Severn Valley increased in popularity.
Right. And 2 of the 3 are running at the moment, 43106 and 75069.
David Williams, And you heard him mention there the scrapyard at Barry in South Wales, where 13 of SVR's engines came from. Trips to Barry feature a lot in the memories of our pioneering engine men. Here are a couple more, from Paul Fathers, followed by Column Howell's.
By around 1970, we'd raised funds at Bewdley to buy 4566, a small Great Western 262 prairie tank loco, which has run on the railway for many years. And we paid £1,750 for that, which again doesn't sound an awful lot of money, but at the time it was quite a lot of money. And that was bought by a small group of people, like many of them. It wasn't bought by the railway as such. And that was dragged up to Kidderminster in a freight train, at the back of a freight train, and then towed round to Bewdley, where a small group of us started to restore it and stripped it down and started to work on it. And then we set about raising funds to buy another one, 5164. By that time I was a little bit older, so I was given the money to go and pay for that one. And I went down to Barry Scrapyard with Bob Sim, who was the founder of the fund. Barry Scrapyard was an eerie place. There were 2 yards at Barry, the top yard and the bottom yard. And there were just acres of locomotives, 200 of them. Some of them were quite complete when I first went there. They even had the safety valves and safety valve bonnets on some of the locos and regulators and things like that. Not many parts had been stripped off them. Eventually, almost all of the 200 locos were bought from Barry, and well over half of them have been restored back to service. It was quite a phenomenon, and without that scrapyard, we wouldn't have as many heritage railways as we do have in the UK. My involvement was with the movement of 5164. I took the money down in cash, hoping that Di Woodham would perhaps give us a discount. We'd been penalised, unfortunately, by British Railways, because when we started buying the locos, we didn't have to pay any surcharge to British Railways, but once they realised what was happening, they added a surcharge on top of it, because the condition and contract of selling the locos to Di Woodham was that they would be scrapped. So once they found out they weren't being scrapped, they wanted, I think, an extra 10%, which we thought was very mean. So we had to raise a bit more money. But eventually we raised that. That was £2,350, took that down in cash. Di turned up on a Saturday morning in his gold Rolls Royce and got out as by appointment, and we went into his offices, which were full of nameplates and number plates off locomotives. So he obviously had a soft spot, I think, for the locos he was cutting up. And then we took the money out and mentioned that we brought cash and suggested that perhaps there might be a discount. And he was very good. He took out his wallet and took £10 out and then said, "There you are, boys, that's for your funds." And he stuffed the £2,350, which, as I say, was a lot of money back then in about 1973. He stuffed that into the pockets of his suit, jumped back in his Rolls Royce and left.
Going to Barry meant getting up early in the morning, putting your overalls in, going up, getting dirty, taking bits off engines, which, by God, they were heavy. Then trying to get the wheels to move, because some of them had been there 7 or 8, 9, 10 years, standing still, cleaning them up, more oil, move it back, move it forward. And eventually Mr. Woodham pulled it out and put it in a siding. So eventually we moved the engine to Bewdley, and we came up in the rear end of a banana train. The train was going to the Midlands, Birmingham, and we rode on the engine. Just to ride on a dead steam engine meant an awful lot to us, and I'll never ever forget the trip all the way. Late at night, it was very cold, and of course we were being bucked all over the place. We got our thermoses and food on there, and we stopped at Cardiff. And of course, railwaymen looking at this old thing, "Oh, what do you want to do that for? What do you want to preserve?" The Severn Valley Railway lines. We'd give them a couple of leaflets, you know.
Column there, recalling how they never missed a trick to promote the SVR. And so it was that on May the 20th, 1970, engines 3205 and 43106, in all their splendour, took the first official passengers from Bridgnorth to Hampton Load, and the Severn Valley Railway was officially open for business. But all that's for the next podcast. Were you there on that great day in May 1970? Were you one of those on the inaugural trips? If so, we'd love to hear from you. We'll be recording more oral histories in the near future. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a like or a comment on the website or social media, and please share it with others. Recording these early days has been such a wonderful part of the Falling Sands Viaduct Heritage Project, and it couldn't have been done without the help of our volunteer interviewers, Phil, Jeff, Tom, Charlie, Richard and Mike. And final thanks go to our amazing interviewees, whose stories we've captured for future generations.
It's been lovely talking to you. Thank you for the opportunity.
So I think we're into this. Thank you very much, David. That was brilliant.
Thank you very much, Julia. It's been great fun. I could go on forever.